It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Be careful who you hire to watch your children, or you might end up with an ancient Greek creature that's actually more of a druid witch tree monster thing. Anyway, I'll get to that here in a moment. Like the Sterlings do in William Friedkin's 1990 supernatural thriller, The Guardian. And that's what I'll be talking about on this week's Monster Mondays. Now, I think we should start with the fact that this was originally based on Dan Greenberg's novel, The Nanny. Now, originally the script, which was co-written by Greenberg and Stephen Volk, was going to resemble the original novel a little more closely. The book is about a nanny who steals children. When the movie was early in pre-production, Sam Raimi was going to make the film, but he eventually left to work on Darkman. So Universal Pictures then brought William Friedkin in to take over. Now, Friedkin had recently gotten into Druid mythology, so trying hard to appease Friedkin, Stephen Volk rewrote the film several times. Now, Raimi's original film was going to be a little bit more tongue-in-cheek, and I think it was supposed to be, and this may be part of the original novel, and may be part of the first go-around of the scripts, was going to be about an ancient Greek creature of some sort. But this was going to be more along the lines of what we would typically see with Raimi's work. But once Friedkin came along, his desires for the story to be changed into more of a druid-based thing, and Universal's insistence on connecting Friedkin's past for having been known for making The Exorcist, and tie that to this film, even using the same font in the credits for this movie as they used in The Exorcist, and really trying to make this a lot more supernatural in nature, twisted the story into something quite different than the original novel and the original scripts were. Now, because Friedkin was all about Druid legends, he insisted on elements of another writer's story to be put into this movie. In this case, it was M.R. James's The Ash Tree that he wanted to incorporate into this script. Friedkin was obsessed with this. Now, this led to Volk ultimately having a nervous breakdown, and he needed to leave the project, leaving Friedkin to finish the script with principal production already having begun. So it was a messy experience. Now, of course, Friedkin, like I said, was best known for 1973's The Exorcist, but he was also well known for his 1971 Best Picture winning film, The French Connection, which he also won the Best Director Oscar, too. And, with The Exorcist, he was also nominated for Best Picture and Best Director. So bookmark The Exorcist for a little bit later this year, where I'll have a lot more to say about that. Now, in the lead as our evil nanny is Jenny Seagrove. Now, at the time that this film was being made, she was actually still relatively young and kind of a little bit of a newer face, even though she had been in movies in the 80s. She was still in her early 30s. Before this film, she did appear as Dr. Sarah King in Appointment with Death, which is one of the several Peter Ustinov, Agatha Christie, Poirot mystery films. Now, playing Phil Sterling is Dwyer Brown, who is mostly a character actor. He's got a ton of credits in movies and TV series that most people my age have seen over the years. And he's probably best known for being Kevin Costner's father in the 1989 Best Picture nominated baseball drama Field of Dreams. Interestingly, in 1986, Dwyer Brown was a contestant in the final 6 episodes of the game show Tic-Tac-Doe. And he had previously worked with William Friedkin in To Live and Die in L.A. By far and away, though, the most recognizable member of the cast, at least for me, is Carrie Lowell, who plays Kate Sterling. Now, Lowell is probably best known for playing Assistant DA Jamie Ross for a couple of years on Law & Order. Of course, what I know her best is as Bond girl Pam Bouvier in one of my all-time favorite James Bond films, License to Kill, opposite Timothy Dalton. She also had a small part in Leaving Las Vegas, too. And I remember her being the main reason why I really kind of wanted to see this movie once it hit video in late 1990. Now, history does not really look fondly at The Guardian in terms of positive reviews. Roger Ebert named it as one of his most hated films. Other critics would be a little less negative, but not ever fully positive. Even Jenny Seagrove said the film is good fun to watch, but the script was pretty awful. It was a mess. Everything was kind of being written and rewritten on the spot. And she's glad that that it did ultimately become a cult film in the decades that followed its release. The movie opens by telling us that there's a sect of people known as Druids who worship trees and sometimes even make human sacrifices to them. Their belief is that each tree contains guardian spirits of goodness and what have you. However, sometimes the spirit within the tree is evil and a monster. We then see a couple who are headed off for a weekend away, leaving their 2 kids with their nanny, Diana. The parents have to return because the mother forgot her glasses, and when they do return, the mother realizes that Diana has made off with their infant. Diana has taken the baby to a gnarly-looking tree where she holds the baby up to the tree, and it disappears and ultimately becomes part of the tree itself, with the crying baby's face appearing almost like a carving in the roots of the tree. 3 months later, Phil Sterling arrives in Los Angeles to accept a new advertising position. He and his wife, Kate, moved into their new house, and she reveals that she is pregnant. And as time passes, she gives birth to a son, Jake. Kate then decides to get back to work, which would mean that they would ultimately need to hire a nanny. And they call the Guardian Angel Nanny Agency to begin interviewing women. There are 2 finalists that begin to emerge for the position, a younger college student named Arlene and a nice English lady named Camilla. Camilla does seem particularly good with Jake. However, Kate is a little concerned over how attractive Camilla is. But they kind of generally like her, but they actually like Arlene better. They actually initially planned to hire Arlene, but she's killed in a fairly gruesome bicycle accident where she falls off a cliff. Camilla is hired because, well, nothing is more pure than winning by default, I guess. Late one night, Phil isn't able to sleep, and after a small earthquake, he goes to check on Jake to find him missing from his crib, but he soon discovers Camilla is in the bath with Jake. He's not exactly turned off by her nakedness, but she also compliments Phil on being a good father to the little boy. She says that she never knew her father, and her mother died when she was just a baby. When Phil suddenly falls back to sleep while trying to get some work done, he wakes to see that gnarly-looking tree at the beginning and Jake lying at the base of it while a scary wolf growls over the child. Phil wakes up from the nightmare and ultimately goes back to bed. But later, Camilla and Jake are in a field where 3 bikers approach her, and they basically steal the money in her purse and threaten her. She runs into the tree line and they follow, and she eventually leads them to our real star of this movie, the scary gnarled tree, where it comes to life and decapitates one dude, eats another, and tears the third apart. Wolves eat the remains while another body, which has been impaled basically on a root, is barbecued when he suddenly lights on fire. After a dinner party, Phil has a nightmare where he has sex with Camilla. And that's not the only man that she's kind of bewitched by her looks. Later on, having infatuated the Sterling's neighbor and friend Ned, he tries pursuing her for a date. And she's like, tells Kate that, she wants to go out shopping. Kate offers her a ride, but she ends up deciding to walk because she says she likes going for walks. And that's when Ned sees her walking on the road that night. And he follows her to a creek before seeing her lying naked at the base of our tree surrounded by big wolves and being caressed by the branches of the tree before she kind of fuses into it. The wolves chase after Ned, who does make it back to his truck, and he gets home and tries calling to get help for the wolves, which he also calls coyotes. They look more like wolves. They're much larger than I would think a coyote would look like. But anyway, those coyotes, wolves, whatever you want to call them, are surrounding his house. He then tries calling the Sterlings and leaves a rambling message trying to warn them about Camilla. And as he tells them not to let Camilla into their house, the wolves get into his house and attack him. When he flees to the outside, Camilla is there and tells him that he should not have seen what he saw because he shouldn't have followed her. He tries to bunker himself in his basement only for the wolves to get him. And with a wave of Camilla's hand, all evidence of the bloody murder is seemingly cleaned up. Phil finds the message on his machine, but not the one that we expect him to find from Ned, but from Molly Sheridan, who wants to meet with him. She sounds rather upset. Molly was the mother who discovered her baby having gone missing at the beginning of the movie. After that, the message from Ned begins to play, but Camilla interrupts Phil to look at a possibly sick Jake. And I guess Phil doesn't think to check that message again from Ned for quite some time. However, he does follow up with Molly Sheridan and goes to the Sheridan's house. Molly doesn't have a picture of this Diana that worked for her, but she describes her looks to him, and he begins to realize that Diana and Camilla are probably the same person. The little boy that Diana looked after, as well as the baby girl that she made off with, says that she has a birthmark that Phil has seen because of that sex dream he had of her. He goes home to confront Camilla. He doesn't find her, but listens to Ned's message from the night before, and he starts to slowly get the picture that Camilla is not who she claims to be, especially after he goes over to Ned's house and finds him missing. Phil comes home from Ned's to find Camilla, and he confronts her about her past. And he tells her that she's fired when she can't really answer any of his questions to his satisfaction. In the whole hubbub, Kate says that something's wrong with Jake, and they rush him to the doctor, and he's breathing normally, but he won't open his eyes. And after several hours, Jake does seemingly return to normal. And as Phil leaves to get the doctor, Camilla arrives, and it seems as though maybe she has some sort of connection to Jake's condition. She tries taking Jake from the hospital, but Phil shows back up in the room and punches her out, and the couple leave with Jake and go home. But when they get there, they are surrounded by Camilla's wolves. Phil escapes into the woods with Jake while being pursued by Camilla, a flying Camilla, I should make note of, while Kate gets the keys to her Jeep to follow. And when Kate gets to where Camilla and Phil are at the base of her gnarly tree, she hits Camilla with the Jeep, and she flies into the tree, and it appears that she's been killed. They report everything that's happening to the police, who investigate, and they don't find Camilla's body. They don't believe that she was flying after Phil in pursuit as he ran away from her. They don't believe anything about Camilla because the name she was using belongs to a woman in New Orleans who wasn't an immigrant. So the cops are basically useless, like cops can often be. They did see the faces of babies in trees, but just call them engravings. So they are completely and totally unwilling and uncooperative. So Phil and Kate leave the station, and Phil decides he's going to cut down the gnarly tree to fix this himself. Kate is at home with Jake alone, which is surely a good idea. No, I'm kidding. It isn't a good idea at all. Camilla is there, and she's got spooky bark coming through her skin in places. As Phil begins to starts up the chainsaw to cut down the gnarly spooky tree, the tree begins fighting back with its branches and roots. But as he cuts into it, it begins to bleed. And as he cuts more, it begins to hurt Camilla too. As larger pieces of the tree is cut off, Camilla's limbs begin to fall off until she eventually explodes into 1,000,000 pieces of wood and bark. It's time to get to those 3 things that I like about any movie that I cover here on Monster Mondays. So in this case, I'm going to have 3 things that I like about The Guardian. First up, I need to give Jenny Seagrove a lot of credit. She somehow kind of upstages a Bond girl. She's surprisingly kind of seductive as Camilla. It's almost unsettling. And what's great is that there's only really one time that you actually see Jenny Seagrove wearing any kind of makeup that's obvious. At one point she puts on red lipstick. That's it. Most of the time she's very natural looking, which I think is kind of maybe to play up the druid kind of in touch with nature sort of thing. But I mean, she has this calming kind of soft British accent, and she is a pretty attractive lady. There's also something kind of dark and cagey about her too that makes her relatively dangerous, or at least suspicious, just by the way that she looks at a character. Honestly, the movie works because of her. You kind of know she's going to, put that baby into a tree and sacrifice him, or at least that's her plans. We know that because we've seen movies. Yet there's that scene with the raping bikers who try to attack her in broad daylight. It's a strange scene. It's a strange scene, to be sure, that I feel like is really only here to kind of quote unquote sex up the movie, because that's how this era of thrillers and action schlock worked at the time. It's a little weird that they have to go to rape for that, but whatever. She helps. She kind of helps get what's coming to these jerks. And it's a pretty good scene of seeing them getting torn up, eaten, and, lit on fire. So she is kind of winning you over while also winning over the Sterlings, while also very obviously wanting to kill a baby. It's one of those movies that is completely dependent on a single character being able to carry it. Yeah, this movie isn't particularly great. It's like a bunch of scenes strung together where we we kind of alternate between seeing Camilla be the perfect nanny and be a monster lady who wants to sacrifice a baby to a tree. The scene in which Ned gets killed by Camilla's wolves is the only scene that really takes its time to be thrilling. So it's really left to Jenny Seagrove to kind of carry this movie, and she actually kind of does a pretty good job. And admittedly, it does help that she's good looking and often naked in this, so it makes this messy screenplay kind of watchable. The second like that I have for this movie is actually that this movie is not too bad with some gore and some good kill scenes. The movie is kind of not scared to put some real gnarly imagery into it. And yes, I've used the word gnarly a lot in this episode, but it's an apt word for the imagery in this. You have this straggly, scary tree with a huge trunk that looks like it kind of has a monster face on it. And it does, because it uses its monster face and monster mouth to eat one of those rapist bikers. But there are also the faces of babies that get sacrificed to the tree, and that's pretty disturbing too. You don't normally see dead babies in horror films. Honestly, outside of something like Stephen King's It, you normally don't see dead characters younger than maybe 17 or 18 in horror movies. So to see these kind of frozen visages of crying babies is, it's gnarly. You do get some other good horror stuff like, Jenny Seagrove being part person, part tree, and when you really see her do really monster stuff, like when she attacks Ned, and when she takes on Kate to get Jake back for, to sacrifice the tree. I mean, she's naked, but she has these strategically placed pieces of bark placed on her to make it look like she's in mid-transformation. Of course, when you get to the scenes like with the bikers and Ned being attacked by the wolves, you get some human bodies torn up and hands being detached from wrists and guys' bodies lighting on fire and getting impaled. You name it, this movie does it to a person's body. So even though, as I kind of bemoaned earlier, the movie is a lot of collection of horror scenes and rarely takes its time to really have a cohesive plot or pace, this is taking advantage of its horror elements in terms of the kill scenes at the very least. Now, thirdly, this isn't so much about the movie itself, but why this movie was one that I really wanted to see when it came out, and I found out there was some druid business in it. So first of all, let me just say I'm pretty sure druids aren't baby sacrificing monster people. Let me get that right out of the way. But you can't help but hear stories about druids like this. It becomes some sort of that, I don't know, and maybe it's because I grew up in the 80s. You heard a lot more of the satanic panic type of stuff. So you kind of get like that demonic sort of activity that we're told people take part in when they're not, white and Christian, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, when I was a kid, I lived in an apartment complex that in one part of the complex had this weird sort of, I call it a courtyard between four buildings, but it really isn't a courtyard, but it's the best way that I can describe this kind of open space where it's blocked off by four buildings with only little sidewalks to get into it. But in this sort of courtyard, there were like 6 or 8 trees in it. And it wasn't that big of an area to have these trees planted in. But so just in between all these buildings were these trees packed in close to one another. And what's more is that this little patch of trees or courtyard or this kind of, I don't know, grove maybe, would capture wind. So it always felt colder than it was outside of that area. And it was also due to there being trees in there. It was always darker because of all the shade. It had this kind of eerie feel to it. And also, of course, it would capture wind sounds as well. So, it's just kind of a creepy little area. So, with all that, naturally, kids in the apartment complex would kind of tell stories. And surely enough, a sort of urban legend, I guess, arose about these trees. In each tree, there were these markings in them that, I think people just did to be spooky, or they were just screwing around with the trees or whatever. But the story that we all told was that a dad went crazy and killed his family and put the bodies of his wife and his kids into the trees. The markings, which were something almost like tally marks, so these tally marks indicated what order the murders happened. It was also something all us, little kids believe, because we always like to be titillated with spooky stories and stuff. But again, because of the weird wind and the chill and the darkness, there were certain times we would say that you wouldn't want to be in there, and that you might even hear the whispers of the murderer, and the trees that didn't have bodies in them might soon house your body. So yeah, this movie kind of brings back that sort of stuff. And whether the movie or that urban legend of Charleston South Apartments is any good or worthwhile, it does help bring back some of those old spooky stories of a childhood that is many years gone by now. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Next time, we go back to Burt I. Gordon and H.G. Wells with the 1977 giant bug movie Empire of the Ants. Until next week, stay spooky.